Perfect. There we are. All right, great. So hi, everyone. Can y'all see it now? Just to verify, I can see it. Okay, yes, cool. So if you're not somebody from my office, thank you folks for being here with me today. If you're new to this, my name is Lizzie. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am currently a student engagement coordinator. Hi, Duran, for the Women and Gender Resource Center at the University of Alabama. But prior to my position here at the WGRC, I was the graduate assistant for the Safe Zone Resource Center at the University of Alabama. So for about 5 years, I, as a staff of one, ran the LGBTQ Center here at the university. And as I was also dissertating and working through a PhD program, I ended up doing what people recommended I do, which is write a dissertation that is also about what I did on campus. So here we are, and that is what this is. So this presentation is a component of my dissertation. It's kind of a part of the study. It's not the whole thing. It's just kind of one major theme that came out of my research. And so we're talking today about invisible labor, specifically for queer women in LGBTQIA+ advocacy roles. And I want to begin, maybe I can pull this up double screen. Perfect. I want to begin today with a quote from Adrienne Rich. She says, "When those who have power to name and socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you. When someone with the authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium. As though you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. It takes some strength of soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, this non-being into which you are thrust, and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard." So in this selection, Adrienne Rich is talking specifically about representation of diverse, marginalized identities in teaching materials. So the experience of students sitting in a classroom and not seeing themselves represented in the materials that they're reading. But for the purposes of today, we're going to be looking at the way in which this also holds true for practitioners who do identity-based work for an identity that they share and find that their experiences are not represented, are not valued, are not supported by their institution. And as we're moving through kind of the material that I'm presenting today, what I'd like for you to kind of try and hold in your head is that selection in the middle of this Adrienne Rich quote that says it takes some strength of soul and not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, because we're going to come back to that and talk about what that means for us. I am not specifically going to talk about LGBTQ specific terminology. I'm going to incorporate it into into my presentation today, but I'm not going to say, but I'm not going to give definitions just because we would be here all day. It would be much longer than a 50-minute presentation. So if you scroll up to the top of the chat, there is a link that I've posted in there. It's the GLAAD Media Reference Guide for LGBTQ terminology. So feel free, if you're worried about not knowing what a term means or anything like that, feel free to pull that up and use that as a reference throughout. I would have loved to have gone through the whole acronym and talked about language a little bit more than I get to today, but we just don't have time. So I want to make sure that I can be respectful of your time and of the space. That being said, I am going to define some terms. And the first one I'm going to define is invisible labor. Now, this is a term that we hear kicked around a lot, specifically if you do any sort of inclusion or diversity work. But I want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of the way that I'm defining it and the way that I'm approaching it in my study. So invisible labor is any form of labor that explicitly or implicitly, that is explicitly or implicitly required by employers, that is necessary to the profit of that institution, but is overlooked, undervalued, or undercompensated. And within that, invisible labor tends to be reproductive labor rather than productive labor. So productive labor is effectively the creation, marketing, and sale of anything that directly leads to a profit for the institution. So if we're talking about visible labor in higher education, we're looking at people who teach classes, who write research grants, and who publish in articles. Most administrative roles are reproductive labor, meaning that they are kind of in the background, making things work, but they're not as visible and they aren't as valued by the institution as a whole. For most people who do forms of invisible labor within higher education, it also means that those roles are compensated less equitably than people who do productive labor. So if we think about this in terms of administrative roles, positions in financial affairs, positions in admissions, things like that at the University of Alabama, because we have such a successful athletic team, positions in athletics tend to be higher compensated roles than positions in, say, student affairs or diversity, equity, and inclusion. The reason for that is because the higher compensated roles tend to be more productive. They correlate directly to profits for the institution as a whole. Whereas reproductive roles, say roles in student affairs where student caregiving and support is a major component, are equally important to the functioning of that institution and to the profits that they derive from the students who pay tuition. But because we can't directly correlate those to the sale of our product, we don't get the same recognition from the institution for them. And these types of reproductive labor can look a lot of different ways, but specifically today we're going to talk about emotional labor and aesthetic labor. So emotional labor is emotional regulation of people, utilizing one's own emotional state or emotional intelligence to support others. Those are all types of emotional labor. And then aesthetic labor is one that maybe we don't think about quite as much unless you regularly think about the way that you perform professionalism to the rest of the world. But aesthetic labor is about the way that we present ourselves outwardly in a professional setting. It's about the type of clothing we wear. It's about how we dye or don't dye our hair, how we cut our hair, whether or not we wear makeup. But it's also about things like whether or not we come to work with piercings or visible tattoos. So we want to be thinking also about the way in which aesthetics, professionalism aesthetics, contribute to the way that we're perceived by others. And within the context of my study, the women that I'm interviewing for this study talked a lot about aesthetic labor. So we're going to look into that. But both emotional and aesthetic labor tend to be overlooked, undervalued, and undercompensated by their institutions, despite the fact that not performing them comes with either stigma and open discrimination or by receiving poor job performance reviews and being unable to perform the job as it was written. Okay, I would imagine that for most of us here today, we probably recognize that student affairs work, student caregiving work is a feminized role. Most of the people, it looks like in the session, use she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs pronouns. So I would imagine that you're aware of this just from your own personal experience. But if you're not, heads up, if you are walking into a student affairs division, you're probably looking at mostly people who present to the world as feminine. So statistically, these feminine identities dominate caregiving positions, which means that more and more as we're seeing diversity, equity, and inclusion work becoming a part of the higher education scope, we're also seeing that DEI roles also tend to be highly feminized because they incorporate a large caregiving aspect. But these positions tend to be feminine dominated, and specifically women are more likely to work in these positions and specifically to work in roles in which they are required to give a significant component of emotional labor in addition to their job description. So they have a job description, and then along with that, or somewhere in between the lines, there are all of these requirements that kind of go along with that, those unspoken rules of what you do in your day-to-day labor that require emotional work. Emotional taxing work, because it isn't explicitly listed, because it's very difficult to define emotionally taxing work in a job description, at least in a way that would make it through any HR department, are undervalued and poorly supported by institutions of higher education. So when I say undervalued and poorly supported, I'm not just saying that these people are undercompensated or underrecognized for their work, but also institutions tend not to create support systems there to help people be more effective and efficient in their work. And then we've also got to talk about LGBTQIA+ services in higher education. So I interviewed 14 participants, and they were in a variety of different positions in LGBTQIA+ student services. All of them, despite whether they were an administrative assistant, a director, a student coordinator, a graduate student, every single one of them listed the following criteria as required and listed in their job description for their work. And that holds true as well. Most of the research out there that describes these types of positions lists these 6 things as well. So for people who are working in this field, they are generally asked to provide crisis support to students, develop student programming, and plan events. They're asked to assist with discrimination, harassment, and reporting. They're asked to provide policy advocacy to the institution as a whole, and they're asked to provide educational outreach and professional development to folks regarding LGBTQ specific identities, issues, and needs on campus. So these are kind of the basic job description things that they're the things that show up in job descriptions. All right. I am briefly going to go through my study design just so that y'all kind of know where I'm coming from. I want to get to a place where we can ask questions at the end. Even though I can't see your faces, I'd love to have conversations in the chat. And so I'm going to tell you just enough that you know kind of where I'm coming from and how the study was designed so that we can move into my findings and you'll kind of know how I came up with this information. So the findings presented here were developed as part of a larger study. It's a part of my dissertation study for my PhD requirement. And I was hoping to engage in inquiry into ways in which queer women experience personal and professional aspects of LGBTQIA+ support and advocacy work in higher education. So through this inquiry, it became clear that invisible labor was a major theme and was consistent throughout all of the experiences of the participants of my study. It's also important to note that my study was comprised of 2 qualitative methods. So I conducted qualitative interviews with 14 participants nationwide. And of the participants that I recruited, they were asked to have an official role in LGBTQIA+ support or advocacy in their institution. And they were asked to either identify as a woman or identify as somebody who is perceived to be a woman by people within their institution. So largely participants who volunteered to be a part of the study decided for themselves whether or not they felt they qualified as somebody who would be representative of my study, and I allowed them to define that for themselves. My study also incorporates autoethnographic data that was collected from my own experiences in LGBTQIA+ student services. So if you've never heard of the term autoethnography before, it's a $5 word that basically says that I use my own experiences as data in my research through the form of narrative storytelling. So I've got descriptive interviews from 14 participants, and then I also have my own experiences provided in the form of a narrative that are incorporated into the study. My research questions for this were not specific to invisible labor. It just kind of became a thing. So I was asking how queer women in LGBTQIA+ support roles on college campuses navigate their identity and professionalism. And within that question, I'm looking at how they navigate normative systems and patriarchal systems within their institution. I'm also interested in learning more about how queer women navigate chosen family and queer kinship and support caregiving and advocacy roles with students. So those were my primary research questions. And from those, it became clear that invisible labor was a huge component. As far as my theoretical foundations go, my primary theoretical foundation involves incorporating intersectionality into the way that I developed, conducted, and analyzed my data within the study. So when I talk about intersectionality, what I mean is not only am I looking at multiple intersections of identity, so queer and woman, I'm also interested in a whole person perspective of how these women navigate their space and perceive the world. So throughout the course of my study, not only am I looking at how they navigate the world as a queer woman, I'm also asking questions about how they navigate issues of race, of ability status, of socioeconomic class, and all of that stuff. And through that, I've developed some themes that came out for everybody. It's also important to note that in my interviews, I'm conducting feminist qualitative interview. which is a little bit different than different forms of interview that y'all might be familiar with. So with feminist qualitative interview, those interviews tend to be semi-structured or non-structured. Mine were semi-structured, and what that means is that I have an interview protocol, but if something comes up that's relevant to my research questions that's not in the protocol, we deviate. They tend to be a little more conversational than they do just kind of a question and answer situation. In addition to that, feminist qualitative interviews are non-hierarchical, which means that I don't position myself as researcher and my participants as participant, where they are subject to my questions, but rather we are engaging in co-constructing meaning together. And in order to do that, there are a couple of things that we have to do. We have to establish intimacy and openness with one another, meaning that I engage in conversational discussion with them rather than question and answer. But also I have to be vulnerable with my participants in order for that intimacy and openness to occur. That happens through self-disclosure, both through interviews as well as in my data, which is part of why my data incorporates autoethnography. All right, let's move into the findings. So in the findings, as we're talking about instances in which invisible labor shows up for LGBTQ women doing this type of identity work, there were a few kind of major categories that came up. The first one that maybe is the most, the one that we would expect is caregiving and kinship. But because these women are LGBTQ identified and they're working with LGBTQ populations, this happens in really unique and nuanced ways that are specific to the queer community. So it's important to note that within queer communities, kinship and chosen family are a major cultural construction. And it's designed this way because so many LGBTQ folks do not get to keep their family of birth. So what's happened within our communities, no matter where you go, if there is a tight-knit LGBTQ community, you are going to see some sort of familial structure taking place within that. People are not only friends and community members, they are part of the same family. And they develop roles within that family that mimic a biological family structure. So we have this happening in LGBTQ resource centers, which if we're thinking about labor means that the women who are engaging in these leadership roles within these communities are not only mentors and support structures, they're also mothers. And so there's a big difference between what somebody is asking of you if they're asking you to be a professional support system versus if they're asking you to be their surrogate mom. So on the job description, we're looking at student support and crisis intervention type roles, but those professional boundaries that exist in other forms of relationships with students break down in LGBTQ centers. And so the women that I interviewed all talked about the fact that, one, they took calls from students 24/7. They help students with things that you would expect a biological mom to do, everything from helping them figure out how to navigate their coursework, from paying attention to helping them navigate relationships, especially first relationships, to scheduling doctor's appointments and taking calls in the middle of the night when a student was in crisis, because even though that's not their job, and even though professionally we might view that as an inappropriate role for somebody in that position to have, those undergraduate students viewed that person as a mother figure and reached out to them as such. In addition to this kind of kinship chosen family role, the interesting thing that's happening here is that there are patriarchal family structures that are taking place in queer spaces. So not only are the women that I was interviewing talking about being placed into a parental role, if their students perceived them to be feminine or perceived them to be a woman, they were placed into the role of mother. Students actively called these women mom on a day-to-day basis. As a matter of fact, every person I talked to said that their students called them mom. And even when a person that I interviewed was in an office that had, for instance, a victim advocate or a staff therapist, students would come to them first for help with emotional support, with dealing with crisis situations, and with all kinds of issues that typically we would have said were more appropriate for a person in a therapeutic role to handle. And the reason they were coming to them was because they were perceived to be more feminine. So despite the fact that we're in a space that is supposed to be queer, in the way that we think about relationships and family structures and gender roles, the students within that space are still adhering to patriarchal family structures within those spaces. And down here at the bottom, I have a quote from one of my participants. Stephanie is her pseudonym. I don't use anybody's real name, but she describes this kind of phenomenon as it exists for her. She says, "They lovingly define me as their mom. A lot of them who have really trepidatious relationships with their family members, and I would say particularly for our trans population on campus, I think I have a really healthy parenting relationship with them. And I will be very forthcoming of always saying, I'm not your parent, but you are loved, you are cared for, you are supported." So in this instance, we see Stephanie kind of acknowledging that students see her as a mother figure in her own attempt to create that professional barrier between familial relationship and her professional role on campus. All of the participants that I talked about discussed this anxiety and the conflict between those two roles, and they all navigated it differently, but for everybody, this was a thing that they discussed as something that they struggled with on a day-to-day basis, was navigating these familial roles and their professional role at the same time. All right, in another form of invisible labor, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, all of the participants that I spoke with discussed doing aesthetic labor in ways that are specifically nuanced for the LGBTQ community and for their role on campus. So one thing that we have to know, if you've never done this type of identity work before, this might not be something that you would think about, but queer visibility is incredibly important in these roles. The women that were hired for these positions, the people that I talked to, every single one of them listed their queerness as a prerequisite for the role, and listed being visibly queer on campus, both to administration and to their students, as a major component of their job, as a requirement of their job. And so they all navigated that in different ways, but this was something that they all said, this is a part of their labor. It isn't listed in their job description, is not compensated or supported, we'll find that out, but it is a necessary component of the work. And so I do want to say, this is another quote from one of my participants. "I did not censor people," and Harper had some hot takes in our interview and does not hold back. This is Harper's kind of description of what queer visibility is to them and why it's important. Harper said, "I'm going to dress queer as fuck because that's who I am. I'm going to dress queer as fuck because not only is that who I am, but those are signals within our community to let students know that I identify as they do. And so when I'm in some of those higher political spaces, by showing up authentically, I've been able to build trust and rapport with students, that they know that when I have the ear of someone higher up, I'm able to advocate with them from where I am, representing us as having a seat at the table." So here Harper is saying that effectively their queer presentation builds trust with students, provides them with professional ethos, and allows them to advocate more effectively in those spaces. So one of the things that is really interesting, though, for the women that I spoke with is that they were often torn between walking this very fine line between presenting as queer enough that people recognize them as members of the community so that they had ethos within those spaces, but also presenting as queer in a way that was palatable enough that they didn't experience stigma or pushback from people in positions of power in the institution. And so what they're dealing with here is called heteroprofessionalism. This is a term coined by Mizzy in 2014. And in this term, or in describing this term, what we're seeing is an institution creating a definition of professionalism that values and prioritizes heterosexual forms of dress, speech, and interaction with colleagues. So all of the participants were subject to this heteroprofessionalism to varying degrees. Some talked about having official policies about codes of dress and workplace conduct that discouraged them from doing things that would typically represent queer expression, such as having hair colors that are not natural, piercings besides in their ears, showing visible tattoos, dressing in gender non-conforming ways. And then others who did not have those formal policies, they all talked about the ways in which they were stigmatized based on how they presented queer within their institution. So Stephanie said in her interview, they want me to be queer in a palatable way. So she's describing this instance in which she is being told that she wants, that she should be presenting as queer to the institution by the people who brought her into the institution to be that queer figurehead for the community. But it's also how she presents that queerness is being policed. So she finds herself in this place where she's having to walk that narrow line between being queer enough that people recognize her as such, but not so queer that it makes heterosexual people in positions of power uncomfortable. For women that I spoke with who presented themselves in ways that were recognizably queer, this was the major problem that they discussed. But if we incorporate another lens into this, for women who presented themselves as traditionally feminine, who identified as cisgender women, and specifically for women who identified as bisexual and or pansexual, meaning that they experience attraction to two or more genders, there was a constant battle that they had to undergo in order to present themselves as queer enough to gain ethos from the community. So these women talked about not being recognized as queer and experiencing a lack of trust from students, faculty, and staff when it came to their ability to do their job or their identity within the community as a whole. They also discussed instances in which they experienced overt marginalization and discrimination from LGBTQ members of the faculty and staff because they were not viewed as queer enough to hold their position. So in this instance, I've got Robin saying, no matter who I've been partnered with, it's always been an issue because people don't read me as queer. So basically, when it comes to aesthetic labor, there's a lot of time and energy that goes into creating an acceptable professional persona within queer advocacy and higher education. But no matter where a person seems to be situated, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. People who presented as traditionally feminine within a patriarchal system, who had perhaps straight passing privilege, were more acceptable to people in power in the administration, but did not have the trust or the respect of people within the LGBTQ community. And then people who presented themselves in ways that were very visibly queer had the trust of the community, but did not have agency or support within the larger administration. So people are just kind of at this point picking one or the other, or trying desperately to skirt that line and spending a lot of time and energy and money trying to find a way to make that work. And the last theme that I'm going to talk about in terms of participant data is trauma labor. So I've got trauma labor broken down into two different categories. And the first one is the one that I think if we really thought through what it's like to do this type of identity work, we would more expect to see. And this is working through shared trauma experiences. So what I'm talking about here is when a person is in an identity-based position, they are the leader of a marginalized group, and a tragedy happens, either on campus or in the community as a whole. That person is going to be grieving that tragedy, is going to be dealing with their own emotional upheaval and their own trauma through that circumstance. But as a leader within the community, as a support and caregiving person for that community, they are then asked to tend to the emotional needs of others as they're trying to navigate their own trauma. All of the participants that I spoke with talked about an instance of this happening. But the person who I am referencing here, Robin, talks about this as something that she went through and has gone through multiple times since in her first year of running a center. She says, my first year, I was running a center all by myself. And that was also the same year that Matthew Shepard was murdered. So, you know, those kinds of experiences are really hard. I mean, because you're having to be a support system for the entire community on top of having to deal with the pain that it causes you. For the majority of the places I've been throughout my career, there's always been this expectation that what is hitting me personally because of that shared identity needs to be put on the back burner. Like I've got to compartmentalize that somehow and not show too much of my own emotions, that I'm only supposed to be here to support others. So Robin talks about this, and I had participants who had been working in the field for a variety of different times and years, describe similar instances of experiencing a community trauma and identity-based trauma and being asked to compartmentalize their emotions, tend to the needs of others, without having access to support systems of their own so that they could continue to be a caregiving person to the students that need them. So effectively, this is an invisible labor in the sense that it is underrepresented and undersupported by the institutions in which these people are working. In addition to this idea of working through shared trauma, participants also talked about, and I also experienced, the unspoken requirement of using personal trauma as an educational tool. So most commonly, this happens when people are completing that educational outreach component of their job description. So you are presenting at a conference, or you are giving a Safe Zone Ally training or a professional development seminar. And through that presentation of information, through that form of attempting to educate, you end up sharing your own experiences of marginalization, oppression, and trauma in an attempt to build empathy, to develop ethos with your audience, and to demonstrate why the things you're advocating for are a genuine need. The example that I have for you below, though, is not an example of this underrepresented and certainly undersupported form of labor, but rather an instance of non-consensual emotional labor that a person was asked to do. So one of my participants, Lucy, talks about an instance in which she is in a professional development seminar. It's a diversity training. And she found herself unwittingly and unexpectedly reliving her trauma publicly for the education of other people. So in this instance, Lucy says, so the presenters are talking, and this one year, a woman gives out little scripts. And you know, you have to stand up and you have to read like the silly fact about gay people, like 15-year-old kids. The majority of queer homeless students are kicked out of their homes because their parents reject them, right? And I got that card. So I was kicked out of my house, Lucy says, after the week after I graduated high school. And I'm standing there and I'm reading the stupid cultural sensitivity thing. I wasn't paying attention. And then all of a sudden I see my story on a frickin' index card in the middle of a professional development. It's just like 500 people around, and I'm like, you catch it in your throat when you're off guard and things turn red. And I was like, oh my God, I am the only person here who's ever experienced this. And I'm reading it out loud on a fucking index card. So this is Lucy's experience. This type of utilizing trauma as an educational tool happens a lot in these sorts of diversity trainings. In this instance, this was non-consensual. Lucy did not agree to this. It's also important to note that the person who put her in this position did not knowingly put her in this position. So it was unintentional, but at the same time, she did not have the opportunity to know ahead of time that she was going to be asked to do this, nor did she have the opportunity to say yes or no to this instance of utilizing her trauma. And this is another way that we find invisible labor cropping up. Okay, so I told you all, oh no, there we go, that my study was partially autoethnographic, and it is. And so I chose a selection from my own data, mined from my own experiences, that was the closest representation to a descriptive example of invisible labor in this work that I could. And I'm going to put my glasses back on because I need to read it and read this for you. So this is a selection called Netflix and Heal. And it is about the work that I did in my center the day after the 2016 election. So here we go. On November 8th, 2016, I woke up filled with excitement and hope. The polls promised that for me, this day would provide the same validation and solidarity of the 2 previous presidential election days. One more time, we were going to make history. We were going to make herstory. And at the very least, we were going to demonstrate to the world that this wasn't a place where a man could brag about sexual assault during an election and win. The election had been so triggering that I'd had to return to therapy and even go back to my psychiatrist to increase my anxiety medication. Trump's locker room talk had brought back the flashbacks, nightmares, and hyper-awareness I thought I'd left behind. In my visit to the psychiatrist, he laughed when I said the election was the cause of my return because I was the 10th person that week to say the same thing. All of this was over, though, because every poll put Hillary in the likely winners column. Proudly sporting my I voted sticker, I opened up the office at 1 p.m. and was immediately met with student after student wanting to share their excitement. "Liz, I can't believe it," Wesley exclaimed. "They both voted Democrat. My dad hasn't voted Democrat ever, but he said he couldn't support a candidate who would take away his son's rights. It's the first time he ever stood up for me for being trans." "Oh my God, Wesley, that's amazing," I replied. "It's going to be so validating and a huge relief to know your parents support you." "Yeah, I never thought it would happen like this. I never thought they'd vote for someone because of me," he replied. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I rolled over in bed and shifted my body so that I could reach around my sleeping dogs to check my phone. I'd gone to bed before the election was final, and somehow things hadn't looked good. I took a deep breath and Googled the election results, and upon confirmation that the president-elect was indeed Donald Trump, I checked my Facebook page to see how the rest of my friends and family were coping. Many, like me, had signed off before the election was final, and my wall was still full of posts talking about how they were hoping for a miracle. We'd all been disappointed. Shock is a funny way of making details in the moment seem fiercely vivid. Every breath, touch, sight, memory is stark in contrast to the other moments while I'm experiencing the bodily response of shock. But afterwards, it's all fuzzy. I don't remember how I spent the 4 hours between waking up that morning and the first social media post made by my students and coworkers that day. Stepping out of the shower, I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt. I took my first sip from the second pot of coffee I'd brewed that morning and waited for the social media storm to come. I read along as colleagues and friends talked about their fears for the future, for their children, their changed plans, and smaller dreams, but I didn't see anything from my students. I guess they were in shock, like me, and I decided to do what I could. I messaged the executive members of the LGBTQIA+ undergraduate group. "I'm bringing Pixar and popcorn to the student lounge this afternoon. Let's watch cartoons and pretend that yesterday didn't happen." 2 hours later, I walk into the student lounge, arms full of junk food, to find the lights dim and a room full of grieving people sitting silently, waiting. Wesley ran up to me with tears in his eyes, and we held each other and cried. Dumping my bag of popcorn, chips, and candy on a table near the back of the room, I said, "Okay, I've got movies and food. What do y'all want to do?" We put on Big Hero 6, and students sat clustered together on the floor with pillows and blankets they brought from home. I sat in the back of the room and talked with people as they came in. A senior walked in soon after I arrived and sat with me. "I don't know what to do now," he said. "Tristan and I were going to get married someday, but now we're scared if we wait, we'll lose the right. Now we're trying to figure out if we're ready or if we should risk it." "Well," I responded, "Tristan is in Boston for graduate school now. How are you planning on managing that?" "I guess we just live apart like we are now until I can move up there. It's just so frustrating because this is the big reason why we wanted to wait. What if I can't find work there?" I wish I knew what to tell you. It sucks, and I don't have a solution. All I can say is that marriage equality won't go away without warning. I don't think they could reverse the Supreme Court decision, but if they did, it would be in the news long before it happened. Maybe y'all don't have to make this choice right now. At lunchtime, a woman I'd never seen before walked into the lounge. She had long blonde hair and wore a lacy dress with big hoop earrings. She glanced around the room and pulled her arms defensively across her chest. All the students in the room avoided eye contact with her and turned to look at me. After the past few weeks' increase in queer-phobic harassment, we were all immediately on our guard, and I quickly walked up to meet her. If she was going to start spewing hatred at us, she would direct it at me. I was raw and hurt and spoiling for a fight. I realized that everyone was looking at me, and even though I wished they would stop, I assumed a stance that's become familiar since the election. I stood up as tall as I could at only 4 feet 11 inches, forced a smile, and introduced myself. Immediately her face fell, her arms dropped, and she began to sob. A student nearby handed her a tissue, and between sobs, she told us about her son. My husband and I were really religious, and when our son came out, we didn't understand. Collecting herself a bit, I did a lot of research, though, and learned that religion aside, he didn't choose this. We came around, and when our church rejected him, she took a deep breath. We left. I just want you all to know that I see you, and you matter. She began to sob again as all of us gathered close to her. Samantha, a sophomore officer in the LGBTQ student org, was the first of us to join in what became a massive group hug. A few minutes later, this person we'd never seen before thanked us all and walked out the door. Eyes wide and tear-filled, I looked around the room and realized that we'd all, but most especially I, had been prejudiced against her. Because of my own fear and anger, I'd almost turned away a person in need of support. Around 3 p.m., Ness walked into the student lounge with bags of potato chips and candy under his arm. He said, "I can't stay right now. There's an emergency meeting for all student affairs staff. I'll have to go to that. I'll be back this afternoon." And as he walked into the hallway, I saw a woman come up to him while he hugged her, and she sobbed. After lunch, Ness walked back into the student lounge carrying a copy of The Princess Bride. "Let's put this one on next," he said. "Yes," cried Aaron. "I love this movie." "Why is everyone always talking about this movie? I've never seen it. What's it about?" replied DJ. "Oh, you'll see," said Wesley. "Just put it on already." Ness ejected the copy of Kung Fu Panda 2 the group had been watching, and I breathed a sigh of relief at not having to finish the previous pick. Ness motioned to me to step outside into the hallway. "How's everyone handling things?" he asked. "There's been lots of hugs and tears, but I think they're going to be okay. I'm scared for them this Thanksgiving, though. Family time is going to be harder than usual." "Yeah, we'll have to show lots of support in the next few weeks. How are you?" he asked. I'm fine, I guess. Today's been hard, though, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help, and I don't know how to feel. We were all so sure about the election, and I take a deep breath to keep from crying. He squirms a little, and I can tell by the way he's fidgeting with his hands that he wants to hug me. He almost steps forward and then stops himself. And for a moment, I want that hug. I just spent the whole day working to take care of my students' emotional needs, and I wanted someone to take care of mine. But I knew that I'd just be like that sobbing woman I'd seen in the hall earlier, and I didn't want to be that vulnerable then and there. So I was relieved when Ness remembered himself and acted like I hadn't noticed his offer of friendship and support. "Well," he says, "today is for grieving, tomorrow's for action. Let's just take care of ourselves for now and worry about how we'll handle things tomorrow." For the rest of the afternoon, we took comfort in one another. More people came and went, many brought food, and we cut out leaves to add to our new art project, our chosen family tree. That day became known to all of us who experienced the fallout of the 2016 election together as Netflix and Heal Day. That afternoon, we talked about how our lives would be different, about the narratives we had written for our futures that were uncertain, and that we would have to make peace with the loss of hopes, dreams, and loves for our future. We cried and huddled together, and people brought more food. We took solace in one another, in our chosen family, and tried to seek compassion and hope instead of fear and anger in a new frightening reality. So in my selection, we can see some of this invisible labor taking place. The experience of being a community leader through a shared trauma, as well as this kind of compartmentalizing and self-denying. We can also see the evidence of invisible labor happening through my caregiving responsibilities as a member of the staff in the LGBTQ Resource Center. Despite the fact that I was also experiencing a trauma, my major role that day was to provide caregiving resources to students. And so I was required then to not only perform this labor in a way that was underrepresented and undercompensated by my university, but I was required to disassociate from my own experience of trauma and pain in order to do so. So as we're thinking about, oh goodness, there we go. As we're thinking about where to go with this, there are some things that we want to take into account. One, I'm going to ask you to revisit that quote by Adrienne Rich, specifically that center section where she says it's not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, this non-being into which you are thrust, and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard. That collective understanding is so very important when we're talking about supporting people who do this type of identity-based advocacy work. And it looks a bunch of different ways. One, by being here today, you now know about some instances in which people experience invisible labor in a way that is problematic and makes it more difficult for them to do their jobs. Just knowing that and using that information in the way that you conduct yourself in the workplace is huge. But there are some other things that you can do, some other recommendations that I have for practice. One, we have to practice proactive allyship, meaning that we don't just react to situations of stigma, discrimination, or marginalizations of people, but we look for instances in which people are likely to experience those things and proactively create solutions. So this happens in policy through creating inclusive faculty staff policies. But what's most important, and what seemed most important to my participants and to myself as well, were those informal day-to-day practices, that campus culture, specifically that professional culture within the office. So looking for instances in which people are likely unintentionally, but still clearly being asked to provide emotional labor that is underrepresented in their job description or underpaid, places where people are being policed for their presentation when their presentation is an authentic representation of self. It's really, really important that we collectively come together, look for those opportunities to be a supportive person and offer that support and confront those problematic practices when we see them. We also want to think about ways in which we can revisit professionalism, both in formal policy and in informal interaction. So if we're asking people to present themselves as a visual public representation of a marginalized identity, we cannot, through formal policy or informal practice, penalize that person for doing their job. That is a part of their job. And by making that labor visible, we protect those people and allow them to provide that service to our students. And last but not least, we need to be providing people with a diversity of support systems. So it's not enough to have an identity-based center. We also need to be supporting the people within those centers, which means that if we're providing LGBTQ supports, but there's only one person running the center and they're doing all of that labor, when it comes time for them to need support, they don't have anywhere to go. So we have to be looking for ways to layer support systems through multiple divisions and provide a diversity of those support systems so that those people who are doing that work that we need them to do to protect our students also have somewhere to go when they're experiencing the same types of trauma, harassment, discrimination as other folks. And with that, I am out of content for you. I think we're going to get kicked out in 4 minutes. So in that time, if anybody has any questions or comments that you'd like to throw in the chat, I'm happy to stick around until we get kicked out and engage with y'all in dialogue as best I can in this virtual format. So yeah, any questions, any comments, grievances? Thank you all. Oh, thanks, Courtney. I have not completed my program. I'm hopefully defending at the end of February. So the dissertation is written, at least in draft form. Thank you, thank you. But yeah, it's not official yet, so. Oh, thank you, Greg. Courtney, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you. That's the goal, that we all feel seen, for sure. Yeah. think so. Yeah, let's hope the rest of my committee thinks that the autoethnographic component is a positive addition. We're going to cross our fingers there. Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, my session is complete, unless anybody has any questions. So